All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for,
Actually, good morning. We're still in the morning.
so thank you for joining us for this final event of Ethics Week, where the topic was Women Lead. When Brian Levy asked me to put together a panel about women in the workplace, I immediately went to look within our own faculty of women that are doing work and knowing a lot of the literature out there on leadership development. And we have a stellar lineup that I'm going to go ahead and introduce to you now. So first, to my right here is Cindy Muir. She's an associate professor in management and organization here at the Mendoza College of Business. To her right is Alice Obermiller, the director of experiential learning and leadership development in graduate business programs here in the Mendoza College of Business. To her right is Angela Logan. Her title is the St. Andre Bessette Director of Nonprofit Professional Development, and she's an associate teaching professor here at the Mendoza College of Business. And finally, Amanda McKendree, who is the Arthur F. and Mary J. O'Neill Director of the Fanning Center for Business Communications, as well as associate teaching professor here at the Mendoza College of Business. My name is Robin Kissler, and I am the Director of Non-Degree Programs here at Mendoza. And when we originally got together, we have a nice agenda for you. I think for the first 20 minutes, each person is going to talk a little bit about a topic that they are researching or a topic that they are reading, okay? About 20 minutes after that, I'm going to ask a series of questions, and then we're going to open it up to the group. So while you're sitting there listening to some of the stuff that they have discovered in research, start to think about your own questions that you might like to ask, okay? So, Cindy, would you like to tell us a little bit about some of the stuff that you have been reading and researching?
Sure. So how many of you have heard of or read the book Lean In? Anyone? Okay, a pretty good portion of you. So I remember reading that book when it first came out, and there were a lot of things that I really identified with. So this is a really strong, hardworking woman. She had a lot of funny quotes, for instance, when she compared her work ethic to that of her brother when they were in school. You know, a lot of those comparisons were favorable to her, as you might imagine. And obviously, what's not to admire of a woman that's become COO of a large company like Facebook. And so when I read the book, I think what she's trying to talk about can be distilled into two main topics. So the first is this idea that women encounter bias in the workplace. And she does this by highlighting several structural and systemic factors that women face. One of the ways in which she does this really nicely, for those of you that have read the book, you might remember that she highlights this case of Howard versus Heidi Roizen. And so when she talks about these two leaders, she says that research shows that all you have to do to change perceptions of this leader, and that is holding their behaviors constant, which doesn't really happen in the real world, but in our experiments it does. All you have to do is change the leader's name. So when the leader is named Howard, people rate that leader as better on a number of metrics than they rate Heidi. So obviously this identifies gender bias as a potential issue. At the same time, the other aspect of the book is this focus on leaning in, right? So the idea is that women need to work harder at work. And I don't think Sheryl Sandberg intended to do this, but I think the unintended consequence is the message that it sends, that if only women were working harder, then perhaps we wouldn't see the gender disparity that we currently see at work. And I take issue with that as an implication. And recent research confirms my concern. So professors at Duke were interested in this topic as well. And so they've done some recent research where they took these two broad areas of the Lean In book and they gave excerpts to people. So you either got the Lean In message or you got that there's systemic and structural biases that can hold women back. And then they asked people about what they thought were the factors that contribute to gender bias in the workplace and whether or not they would espouse structural changes. So not surprisingly, the people that read about women leaning in think that the problems that women face at work are caused by them and are their responsibility to fix. So as a result, they're much less likely to advocate for any sort of structural or systemic change that might help them. And obviously that makes sense. If something's your fault, you should fix it, right? And of course, the data don't bear out, I want to be clear, the data do not bear out that women are responsible for gender bias, right? The facts are women graduate at higher rates than men, they have higher GPAs, there's no evidence that women are less likely to want to lead than men, even if they have kids. That idea has been debunked. And yet as a society, we still view the workplace as predominantly male-oriented, right? Think male, think career, think woman, think family, think housework. Women continue to be underrepresented at various levels of leadership, and they continue to make, at least from 2014, 82.5 cents to every dollar that men make. And I want to also be clear, the research also shows that there are no performance differences between men and women at work. So there's a recent study that summarized 142 separate studies collapsing across almost 500,000 employees, and they confirm the existence of a significant pay gap, but no difference in performance. So what this suggests to me is that women are leaning in just as much as men. And so leaning in and of itself is not going to solve the kinds of problems that we're talking about. It can't explain the pay gap, unfortunately. All that said, I think the lean in mantra can be beneficial at the individual level, but with some very specific caveats. So the research is clear. Women need to outperform men in order to gain the same kinds of workplace outcomes. So if you think about it in that way, if the lean in mantra is going to ensure that women work more than men, then perhaps we can reach parity. The problem is research is also clear on something else. When women speak out against structural and societal issues, like I'm doing right now, they tend to be viewed unfavorably, and they're seen as self-interested, right? You're advocating for something that would help you. So what this suggests to me is that as long as you lean in and you're able to consistently perform better than your male colleagues, and you do it without making a whole lot of noise, then absolutely you as an individual can eliminate the pay gap. And in fact, I think this is important to emphasize. At the very top levels, there's research that indicates the pay gap disappears. So for really, really high-performing women, like Sheryl Sandberg, it doesn't exist. And there's even some evidence to suggest that it reverses. Not always, but sometimes it reverses. So that's good advice at the individual level. But if you take this to the group level, what does it mean for women in our society and globally, right? I think it defies logic to think that there are enough women that can lean in at this level consistently that it would reverse the kinds of trends that we're seeing, right? So as my shirt kind of indicates, think, where would we be today if we all focused just on the individual level? And if we didn't advocate for what we think is right and also focus on what's best for the group level? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So now we're going to move on to Alice Obermiller and the topic that she has been reading quite a bit about.
So thank you very much, Robin. So that's a great sequitur, so thank you for the setup. Just women empowering women. So I've been working, I've had the privilege to work with MBAs now for 20 years, and in particular, up-and-coming high potential employees going out into companies, and that I do take as a privilege because I think it's a really unique opportunity that I've had. And one of the areas that I've been really looking at quite a bit over the last several years is McKinsey's Women in the Workplace study that they do every year, just to kind of get a sense of how women are progressing in the workplace, the pay gap and things like that. And one of the statistics that came out in the most recent research was the fact that on the surface, it looks like we're making strides, particularly in the C-suite. There's so much research and evidence to point to the fact that companies that do have women at the helm seem to do better or do equally as good, and so that there's no real difference in gender relative to performance in the company, whether a man or a woman leads it. But that's just a surface data point that really what's going on underneath paints, unfortunately, a less rosy picture. And they began to talk about this broken rung and the idea in the career ladder that there are fewer and fewer young women moving into first level management. And this really distresses me a lot because obviously if we're not building a pipeline of talented women who are going to take over those senior leadership roles, then whatever gains that we're making today are going to quickly fade away. So this is an area that has been really near and dear to my heart working with MBAs because in particular, for the women here at Mendoza, I want to see them succeed when they get out into the work world. I want men to succeed too, please don't misunderstand. But women in particular, because I do think that your path is going to feel different, it's going to look different. And I'm particularly concerned about young women going into STEM. There is so much emphasis on women going into the STEM areas, and I think that emphasis should continue. But what happens when you're not rewarded for that work when you get out into your companies and being able to move into management and have that career progression? So I'm starting to take a deeper look as to why this may be happening, and there's nothing really definitive yet. To kind of point, but I think that there's some hypotheses that we can make as to what's going on. And I think that first and foremost, which is pretty evident, is the systemic types of issues that are in companies that are kind of silent, that I'm not even sure leaders within these companies, even HR, are fully aware of how discriminatory they can actually be. And so I think as women, we have to become more savvy to pay attention to those things before we enter those companies and really understand what we're getting into so that we don't get halted in our careers before they even get started. And so I think the first thing that I'm really wanting to better understand is, helping young women pay attention to old paradigms of leadership. So some things that I think conceptually that are worth paying attention to are things like heroic leadership, or these very masculinized ideas of leadership, which had their place at a point in time, but when a company espouses to be collaborative and flexible and all of these great things on their websites and their paper, and you get out there and then you realize they're not like that at all. They reward the more masculine command and control autocratic types of behaviors, and they reward people moving forward who are very heroic and bold, and that's not everybody, including men. That's not necessarily gender specific, but we attribute it most often to men. And so those are the things that I think as young women we need to prepare young women to pay really close attention to, so that they can recognize it when they see it and then help them navigate through that. Because the other thing, and I was in industry before academia and I've seen it all. I've had over a beer. I could share some interesting stories, as I think just about any woman can. Just some interesting anecdotes. And the thing is that over the years, one of the things that I recognize is that we're not necessarily always encouraged to sort of be ourselves. We're always looking to be something outside of ourselves in terms of our identities and who we should be as leaders. And I'm a big advocate for authenticity. And I'm beginning to see more and more that many of the personalities we attribute to men are not gender specific at all. I've seen bold, aggressive, assertive women take charge, and that's a personality. In my mind, that has nothing to do with gender. And I've seen men who are very quiet and take a much quieter road and shyer role to getting work done. And I think that we need to start valuing people for who they are and letting people sort of find that sort of voice within them, whatever works, because I think there's sort of the best of both worlds we can have. And so as we look to young women, one of the things that I'm a big advocate for is to know who you are, know what your strengths are, and adapt from there. So don't try to be something that you're not, but rather find the best part of yourself and be the best version of yourself. So if you are shy, embrace being shy and be the best version of shy. If you are bold and assertive, be bold and assertive, but be the best version of yourself as bold and assertive, because all of these rainbow of personalities are really important in the workplace. But I think for women in particular, we have to really understand the strengths that women uniquely bring to the table, embrace them, and find pathways. So that's an area, this broken rung is something I'm really fascinated with, and I think we need to find ways to fix pretty quickly.
Thank you, Alice. Angela.
So, not yet. Good afternoon, everyone. I actually come at this topic from a slightly different lens. In my field, in my area of research, I refer to myself as a pracademic, which means that I was at one time a practitioner and now I'm an academic, and I float back and forth between the two. And one of the things that is really resonating with me, both from my own personal experience and my own journey to leadership, and it's interesting that we sort of planned these conversations, but we didn't actually iron out what we were going to say. So to tag on to Alice's conversation about being your authentic self, that was actually the focus of my dissertation research, is what happens when particularly women of color lead nonprofit organizations, lead foundations. And one of the pieces of research that actually bubbled up for me was this whole notion of bringing your whole self to the table. There was actually a study done by Cornell West et al. That talked about the role, what happens to women of color when they lead in for-profit organizations, and they noticed that they actually silenced their voice, that they tried to be something that they were not, that they didn't bring their whole self to the table. So I actually started thinking about, well, what does this phenomenon happen in the nonprofit sector as well? Turns out that it does. And one of the things that I found that really helped to flip the script for me was this whole notion of having your 9-to-5 life intersect with your 5-to-9 life. So there are things that we do Monday through Friday, 8-to-5, 9-to-5, 8-to-8, whatever our work day looks like. Okay, I'm speaking for me. I was here a couple nights till 9, but that's just me. But looking at what it means when that world intersects with your after work hours, the time that you're spending in your life that you're not getting paid for, but you're getting those same leadership skills, you're developing those experiences, but there's this artificial line that we have created in our minds to shut those two worlds off. And so part of what my research is looking at is thinking about how do we bridge those two worlds? And one of the ways for me that bridging occurs is through having conversations about resilience. Because what I have found in my experience is you're going to, in order to bridge the two, in order to do well in my 8-to-8 world, I have to think about what are the skills that are helping me succeed in my other 8-to-8 world, and how can I marry and merge the two. So show of hands, because I come from a tradition of call and response, and y'all are looking a little too serious for me. How many of us have ever gotten stuck, show of hands, have ever gotten stuck in traffic? How many, keep them up or take them down. How many of us have ever had to deal with a growing family or an aging parent? How many of us have had to, have gotten passed over for a promotion? How many of us have failed an exam? Students, notice how many of your professors have raised our hand. Maybe we failed too, okay? How many of us are crawling towards finals week at any given semester? Notice, students, how many faculty are doing the same thing. So how we overcome these things is about resilience. What is it that keeps us going when we have the major catastrophic issues in life? And what are the times that we're dealing with, as I like to refer to it, death by 1,000 paper cuts? Let's be real. We are in an environment where the permacloud is taking us all out. And so how do we get through the permacloud, and spring break is never coming, and we're trying to find a job, and we're trying to deal with change, and oh my gosh, I gotta plan a wedding, and all the and. What is it that keeps us grounded and keeps us focused in on making sure that we are staying true to ourselves and being as impactful as we can in our 9-to-5 world? So this is the pracademic in me, sharing a practical tip that I like to do with folks to help them think about how to keep grounded in this. Hit it. And this is called an exercise that I do with people. It's my resilience strategy. It is actually taking time and figuring out what are the people, places, and things that shape who I am. What are the things in your life that bring you joy? When things get rough and tumble and you just can't deal with the permacloud one more day and it's 4 degrees and you can't take it anymore, what are the things that keep you going that next day, that keep you coming back? So this is my why. So one thing that I would encourage you to do is stop and think about, what is your why? What are the things that you are devoting the time, what are the things that bring you joy? And then do a time audit and think about how much of those things that bring you joy are you actually doing on a consistently regular basis? Because I will be the first to admit, the things that bring me joy are often the things that I spend the least amount of time doing. And what I'm doing the things that are often necessary, that are often critical, that are often important, but sometimes they don't bring me joy. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. So one thing that I would ask you to do, this is your homework. Who knew you were going to get homework from the weekend on the optional panel that you thought you were going to go to, is think about, what is your why? Why do you do what you do? What motivates you? What inspires you? And then put that somewhere so that when you get frustrated, you can stay true to your mission, true to your vision, true to your values, and true to the core of who you are.
Thank you, Angela. Amanda.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I was called to respond to this question, thinking about my role as a faculty member and how I have a wonderful opportunity to interact with students and colleagues every day here on campus. There's one particular data insight that I came across as I was researching a lecture for one of my classes, and it was one of those moments that gave me pause, and it created a moment where I needed to seek outside guidance and able to gain some clarity about what I was reading. A few years ago, a leadership consultancy firm looked at corporate entities to see if there was any relation between the technical or financial acumen that the top leaders held and their perception of success as top leaders. One part of the study noted that they'd like to look at the notion of age, and is there any relationship between age and acumen across those organizations? There was one sentence within that research brief that noted, note the disparity in perceived business acumen early on in career between men and women. So men and women just starting out in their professional positions were susceptible to this misperception that there is more business acumen to be had in the male workforce within those organizations. And then the study moved on to some other questions and said, oh, this is really, now we're moving on to the most interesting question. And for me, I had just read the most interesting part of that study. As someone who works with both young women and young men every day, I wanted to understand why this perceived disparity exists. So I reached out to colleagues that we have in the Fanning Center, and I'm talking about CCOs, Chief Communications Officers, and Chief Executive Officers. And I explained the research study and asked for their insights, and if it was something that they were seeing in their companies. There are two particular responses that stood out to me, and I just want to briefly share the very different reflections on that research. For one woman who runs a very large public relations firm focused on financial institutions, and so mostly financial communications, this research insight resonated strongly with her because she felt it in her own experience. Having come through the public relations, academic training, and experience, she knew that she had to develop that technical acumen, the business acumen, in order to be taken seriously with a number of the clients who she was hoping for. So for her, that meant pursuing an MBA degree. It meant taking the courses that she felt women were not enrolling in, the statistics courses, a lot of the courses in finance. And that is the area that gave her the confidence to be able to pursue the career that she has now. She also responded to the question thinking about the women who worked for her at the company. And for her, it boiled down to the notion of confidence. How are the young women communicating their confidence within her organization? And she conveyed a few stories where she had to step in along the way and encourage the young women in her organization to speak up and to take on more difficult assignments. And she really saw her role as an advocate in making sure that that confidence was displayed in productive ways within her company. The second response to the study came from a woman who runs a large consultancy firm focused on working with female entrepreneurs. And first of all, she didn't believe the study. She right away wanted more information on how they were defining acumen. But then she thought a little bit more, and what really shaped her belief and understanding of this study is looking at the differences across the age spectrum. And she also noted that in her own experience, the more experience she had, and as well as she was getting older, she could rely on that past experience to give her the confidence to convey that to her employees and to her clients so that they would hold that positive perception of leadership for her. The question for us today is twofold, really. One, if this disparity is real and it exists, how can we do that differently as a business school community? How can we address that disparity in our classes? And for you individually, it's a matter of reflecting on the coursework that you are enrolling in now and identifying other courses that you may need to also take during your time here so that you leave here with that strong sense of business or technical acumen. The other question has to do with what if this is just a perceived disparity within the workplace? And this is where the notion of communication is critical. How are you communicating the work that you are doing as you first enter this position? And then how are you also conveying that executive presence, that you are the person that can be asked to take on that more challenging assignment? How can you make sure that you instill confidence in your supervisors so that you will then be selected for those challenging assignments? I saw the study as problematic either way. If it's real, we have to come up with an action plan to address that. And if it's perceived, we also need an action plan to think about who we are communicating, who we are in the workplace.
Thank you. So I'm going to proceed with asking a couple of questions from each of you, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience to ask questions. So Amanda, I'd like to start with you. How has your background in communications helped you navigate difficult moments in your career?
Well, there are moments where I wish I studied anything but communication. I feel like understanding certain situations would be easier for me and less pressure to find the right answer and to immediately go into the research and figure out the problem. But in particular, there are two communication concepts that I wanted to bring up for the audience today. And the first is the idea of framing, and that idea comes to us from a professor, Gail Fairhurst. And she discusses framing as having the power to shape our reality and how we interpret situations and how we navigate our way through challenging situations with others. There are a couple of different components that go into the notion of framing, and one is the power of language. How are you using your language and word choice in order to meet your communication goals? And are you reflective of your role as an effective communicator? That means continually taking stock of what are my strengths as a communicator, but also where do I want to further develop, and what types of opportunities do I need to seek out to make sure that I am continually developing these skills. The other idea has to do with forethought, and that is the preparation that goes into gearing up for difficult conversations. I'm experiencing this right now. I have a very difficult conversation coming up. Someone in this room, actually. So I'm thinking about and doing the necessary work ahead of time to find the information that I need to be successful in that conversation and to be able to brainstorm different alternatives. And the more prepared I feel about if the conversation goes this way, I've got a plan. If it moves in a different direction, I have done some thinking on that possibility too. And that's where I find my confidence in being able to navigate difficult conversations. The last point I would like to make about communication focuses on listening. We often teach courses in speaking and writing, but it's very rare that any of us has taken a course in listening. And there's a lot to be learned in that content area. Julian Treasure, a listening expert, has a wonderful presentation, a TED Talk, about 7 minutes long, where he talks about how we're losing our ability to listen for a number of features, for a number of factors. So if you all have time this weekend, I would encourage you to take a look at that presentation. It's a wonderful way to just be reminded that we need to be intentional with our listening. It's a physical act. Our heart rate should increase. There should be a difference in our body language if we are actively engaged in listening. So framing and listening, I think, are two key communicative takeaways for today.
Excellent. I hope that difficult conversation isn't with me. And if it is, thank you for being very thoughtful about how you're going to handle the conversation. My next question is for Alice. Alice, how can someone tell in the hiring process whether a company is truly inclusive and supportive of women?
Well, you could say there's it's spelled out very easily, but it generally isn't. So the first thing I would say is talk is cheap. I learned a long time ago there's something called espoused values. And that word espouse is really critical because essentially it says we say one thing but we do something very different. And so I think the first thing is when you go into interviews, pay really close attention to all of the people around you and take a look at the number of males versus females. Now, if you're going into a male-dominated career, you could expect there's probably going to be some natural disparity, and so of course that's a little different. But in general, if you're going into something where they've made it very clear that they're bringing on more women and that we really value women and so forth, but you go in and you find that you're sitting at a table where most of the managers you've met throughout the day are men and there are not as many women, that's a telltale sign, and that's something that I think you have to really pay attention to. Again, the bottom line is take a look first at that gender mix to make sure that the numbers sort of match up with what you expected. I think the other thing to look at is oftentimes there are types of things that companies value and behaviors that, again, going back to this idea of sort of there's some masculine stereotypes in leadership behavior that they really value, and that is, I think, a question that every single woman going into an interview should be asking about, but maybe not like right in your face, but more asking a little bit about, tell me a little bit about the kinds of behaviors that are sort of demonstrated here that really speak to the values of the company. It's a hard question, but as you move along into the phases of interviews with a company, these are the types of things you should be looking at because they tell you a lot about the cultural norms and what the company values. And when you start to hear things, work hard, played hard, we do a lot of socializing out of work, we do this, we do that. Again, a lot of it is paying really close attention to what does that really mean and asking and being a little bit curious and asking, follow-on questions, like give me an example of that and share a little bit more about that. Because what they may be telling you are things that are very normative to the organization that are really important that you participate in order to get ahead. And if that's not something you're comfortable with, you may have to think whether or not that's an organization that you're fit with. And this comes up a lot with students, and I'm just going to be really frank, in alcohol. There's so much socializing that's done, when you're in school that revolves around alcohol, but you go out into the business world and that's very much the case as well. And, far be it for me, I like a glass of wine and a good cocktail, but if you're a person who that's not your style and that is a requirement of the job, that's really problematic. And that's where, as leaders, I think you have an obligation to your employees to make sure that when you're social events are important, it's a way to bond with your teams and so forth, but to be really cognizant of the frequency to which you pick things that really become exclusive to groups of people because they either don't like to engage in that or so forth. So I think those are the types of things that you need to be asking for and asking about, as you move down, maybe not the first interview, but as you move along in the interview process, those are the things that you should be discerning a lot more clearly.
Thank you, Alice. Angela, your topic on resilience, I'd really like to know, how are you practicing moment-to-moment awareness? How you change maybe unproductive thoughts to productive thoughts, and how do you do it as quickly as possible?
So I chuckled because this is one of those moments that's described as physician heal thyself. I am lousy at this, and I am the first to admit, but there are moments that I figure out. It's part of it is staying true to what is my core, what are the things that I value, why do I do, what gets me out of bed in the morning, and why do I keep coming back and keep showing up? And sometimes it's as simple as technology can be our friend when we want it to be. So I resisted getting Amazon Prime. I resisted getting an iWatch. I resisted getting Shipt. I resisted getting someone as a housekeeper. But then I realized that my time is not replaceable. My money is. So I can make more money. I can't make more time. So what are the things that are going to help me do what I can do better? So that means that shortly after this panel is done, I'm going to go to my Shipt app, and there's a lovely woman who's going to bring a cart full of groceries to my house. Because I've realized that going to the grocery store is a stressor for me. I can't do it anymore. It's quite expensive to have to, my time is far more valuable. In the last week I've gotten an iWatch, and this little pesky bugger will tell me when I need to breathe. And I roll my eyes every time she tells me, I've anthropomorphized it, she tells me to breathe. And I'm angry about it, but I pause and I take a breath. And then she'll tell me to get up and walk, and then I roll my eyes and tell her she's doing entirely too much. But I get up and I walk around, I pause, and I take a breath. And one of the other things that I do is I've actually developed a mantra. And that mantra is something that I actually repeat to myself when I'm feeling a little rattled. And my mantra, I would encourage you to get a mantra as well. And my mantra happens to be, God of love, I belong to you. I say, and it's actually kind of scary. So the first time when I'm feeling rattled, I'll say it with an attitude, not like when I look at my watch. The second time, I'll start to mellow out a bit. At the third time, I really reflect on what it means. If I believe that God is a God of love, and I believe that I belong to God, this is a you problem, not a me problem. I'm gonna go take a walk. And so there are moments where we have to figure out what is going to center us, what is going to give us pause. Now, do I do it well often? Absolutely not. Do I find myself rattled and frazzled? You better believe it. But what I do is I pause and I take a breath and I remember what matters.
Thank you. Cindy, in your time with us, you alluded to how far we've come on these issues, but at the same time, we're here because we still have a ways to go. What's your sense of how long it'll take us to reach parity?
I don't have great news for you. So the data suggests that if trends continue, at least according to the World Economic Forum, in 2017, they suggested, drumroll, it would take 170 years to reach gender parity globally. Worse news, they readjusted those projections a year later and said, actually, we've started going in reverse. And if trends continue, it will take 217 years before we reach gender parity globally. Obviously, there are countries that are going to take a lot longer than the United States. But I think we should also be aware that the United States is not leading efforts on these issues. If you're shocked by these numbers, you're obviously not alone. They shocked me when I told my husband this morning, they shocked him. They seem unbelievably large. But at the same time, if we think about why these disparities exist in the first place, especially in this day and age, right? We're very lucky that we no longer live in a society, mostly, where when a woman announces that she's pregnant, she's no longer immediately fired on the spot. Right? That kind of overt bias against women has by and large been eradicated. So what we're dealing with now is a much more subtle, almost invisible form of bias that people aren't even aware that they're doing it, right? And both women and men are susceptible to these biases. And again, going back to like the individual versus the group level, if you think about this as an individual, it's very difficult for you to prove, if you will, that you've been evaluated differently than a colleague. A lot of this stuff is happening in your supervisor's head. Obviously, you weren't present for the other person's evaluation. So it can just be very difficult to know that these things are occurring. So I know that sounds like I'm not very optimistic about our chances. But just like those projections were adjusted upward, I think they can also be adjusted downward, right? If we make changes, both men and women at work, then I think we can reach gender parity at faster rates. But we can't just expect to get there without making some difficult decisions.
Very good. So now I'd like to open it up to all of you to ask any of our panelists any questions. And Brian is going to help us by taking a microphone out there so that we can record this for audio purposes as well. We're video and audio recording it. So anyone with a question?
This is a question for Alice. So you said you focused a lot on like authentic self, but I was wondering what you would have to say about the fact that characteristics like boldness and aggressiveness are normally negative when they're used to describe a woman. So like how can we help change the rhetoric surrounding this? Or if, for example, my aggressiveness is described in that way, like what is the best way to respond in order to let someone know that that's not okay?
Thank you very much. That is such a great question, and you're absolutely right. I think, we don't necessarily attribute those types. This is the bias, I think, that is just very societal and has been around for centuries. And I think that the first thing to say is that I think that we have to be more accepting of people's personalities in general. There are a lot of things people do we don't like. But the bottom line is intent is everything, right? So it starts really from that. And if somebody is asserting themselves, a woman, we'll just say, is asserting herself in a particular way, the first question is to ask why, right? And odds are there's something that she's trying to convey that's very important to her. And so just like you would anyone, you should be paying attention to that. I think the other thing, if we look at a little bit of the flip side, and this is something that is very much rooted in leadership development, right, is, and this might be counter to how leaders think, but it's the way that I think when it comes to leadership development, is I as a leader have an obligation to really know who you are. That's my obligation. That's what it means to be a leader. And as a result, part of that means that I'm going to have to adapt my behavior a little bit. And if I know you really well and I have a big personality and you're like, whoa, that is like a wave coming at me every time she comes at me, then I have an obligation to tone it down, dial it back just a little bit, right? I'm not losing any of myself. I'm still probably going to be loud and assertive. But the bottom line is I know my message is going to get heard better if I tone it down a little bit, because you're going to hear me more than be overwhelmed by what's coming at you, right? And so that awareness is really critical, but I'm not losing anything of who I am. I can still be bold and assert myself as needed. But I think it's having that fluidity of being able to sort of read the situation. That's what we call interpersonal dynamics, is this ability to read a situation, be able to adapt to it accordingly. So I think part of that is just when we see personalities that don't jive with who we are, is to kind of ask, what does that say about my own personality, right? If I'm a quieter, shyer type, then the way that I come across to others is probably going to be more in that realm. But it may mean that I have to dial it up a notch in order to be able to be heard. It doesn't quite answer your question, because I don't know that it's always that easy to get people to accept us for who we are. But the bottom line is that I would say that I think when we see people who have the opportunity to advocate for themselves, that is not an easy skill for most people. And I think if you're in a leadership role and somebody's asserting themselves, I get MBAs asserting themselves every day to me in many, many different ways. And I'll just say for any of my students in the audience, you go a whole lot further with honey than you do with vinegar. I'll just say that. My father taught me that a long time ago. And the bottom line is the fact that I value that assertion. I value advocating for something that you want. But as women in particular, we have to do that. We have to find our voices and find it in a way that we know we will be heard. So again, if you are one of those bold, assertive personalities and you're meeting up with somebody who maybe isn't quite at that same level, then you may have to dial it back a little bit. And if you are a shyer, quiet type and you're meeting with somebody who's a little bolder, you may have to kick it up a notch. And I think that adaptation can help a lot.
This is for anyone who wishes to answer. Excuse me. I was just wondering what you guys believe that men should do to kind of stop being from the bystander, because I feel like you guys explained, gender parity is not an effort for women alone to bear. How would you kind of suggest upcoming men in Mendoza or just business kind of change the field alongside women, or kind of help in the effort of ending gender disparity?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for asking this question. Because actually, the people that I think we need to speak to the most about these issues are men. Men are the ones in power, and so they're the ones with the ability to make structural changes. So what should you do? Advocate for gender equality whenever you see any evidence of a lack thereof. Research also shows that the men are rewarded for these kinds of actions. So unlike the reaction that women get when they advocate for these things, people are going to love you for it, both men and women. So just stand with us, do what you can. I think for everyone in the room, so I teach, I have taught diversity, I don't do it here. One of the things that I frequently talk about is implicit bias. Everybody thinks that implicit bias is someone else's issue. No one thinks that they do these things themselves. I'm not sure that I've ever had someone say, "You're right, I'm biased." If none of us are biased in this room, I don't know how we're coming up with the data that we come up with. So we all have to acknowledge and admit that we have biases that we're probably not even aware of that impact our judgments. And then we have to take it one step further. We all have to say that it is unacceptable for us to allow these biases to impact our decision making, right? It's not fair that you somehow react to women and men differently, minorities and non-minorities differently, because you have these biases that you're not even aware of. So I think when we do those two things, we're more likely to take responsibility for the kinds of decisions that we make, and then we put structures and systems in place to help us make better, less biased decisions. Is it that easy that you're just going to completely eliminate bias from your life? No, but I think any efforts that you make individually to reduce bias can collectively make a really big difference. Thank you.
So, my name is Bree. I'm a senior here. Going off of the two questions that were asked prior, I actually want to tie it back to a class that I'm actually here for, but this has been great. And it's Values-Based Leadership with Christopher Adkins, and we're reading a book in which it's called Give and Take by Adam Grant, and I believe it's in one of the chapters, but there was research done basically talking about how the wage gap, I disagree, but the wage gap isn't necessarily based on there being bias in men getting paid more, but for the fact that women typically don't negotiate their salaries. And this is because the research has shown that women tend to, I guess, not feel like they can. Has this been any experience of yours, and what would you say, or what advice would you give to someone looking for a job or possibly going to be in a position in which they should or need to negotiate their salary in order to make sure that they're on level with other men working with them?
I got this one. Knowledge is power. Information is out there. Do your research, do your homework, and come armed to the conversation. What that actually looked like for me was that there was a scenario where I was offered a position, and I paused and I took a breath. And I thought to myself, that doesn't seem right, A, because it was lower than I anticipated, but we'll move on, but B, it just doesn't seem right. And the person across the table from me said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "This is lower than my number two would be making." "Oh, let me redo some math. Why don't you redo some math and get back to me?" But I would not have known that had I not done my homework, had I not done my research, had I not been in a position to look at that. And to your larger question of women don't assert themselves, it's not perceived, it is a tricky case. And actually, when Cindy was talking about implicit bias, I was so glad that you brought it up, so I didn't have to. One of the things that we've kind of not talked about is the impact that race and gender can have on these conversations, because that's where a place where implicit bias actually will show up in weird and interesting ways, in that there's actually research that's been done that talks about the notion of the angry black woman. And what is really happening is women of color, particularly African American women, are conscious of that bias, and so we actually hold back our emotions because we know that we will be perceived as being angry. And so there's a natural tendency to actually, but the problem or the challenge becomes, if you don't show any emotion, then you're aloof and detached and you don't really care. And so it's about having knowledge and about having access to all the information that you can, and recognizing that we all bring biases to the table, and even by our own biases about how we might be perceived. So when I walk into a room on any given day, I have a notion in my head of what I think people are thinking, and they are thinking about all sorts of other things that have absolutely nothing to do with me. So that's my own bias working against me. So making sure that you are looking out for yourself and having the knowledge necessary to negotiate for yourself, and absolutely get everything. There's actually a study I saw recently that shared, and men, I apologize because I know it's none of you, but they're your colleagues outside of this room who do this, that on average, a woman and a man will see the same position description, and a woman will only apply for the position if she has, was it 90%? 90 to 100% of the qualifications, whereas a man will apply for the position if he has 50 to 60%. I'm just gonna let that rest in the atmosphere for a moment. Do with that what you will.
Bree, I know from my experience is that early in my career, I did not negotiate. I just never felt like that I could. It was when I started managing other people and hiring people that I saw how often others were automatically or instantly coming back to negotiate their salary or negotiate their benefits, okay? So I've gotten much better at it. I would say the last couple of positions that I have had, I've insisted and I've known right away that I was going to go in and negotiate for something higher. So I think it's a practice, but it took me a while to realize how others are doing it and how it would benefit me.
Question here. Hi. This is for any of you. We've briefly touched on kind of the eradication of that overt bias to be replaced by more subtle, suave, sophisticated, and maybe most importantly, like unknowing implicit bias in the workplace. I was hoping to get some insight on any strategies or mechanisms that we might use to detect that as we go into the workplace, especially as a male moving out of Mendoza into the business world. Just being able to navigate that inequity and primarily personally how to give myself a check and balance in that regard.
One thing that, and I'll share this sort of a follow-on to the earlier question about this, is I think, you know when you have a bias because it comes glaring in your head in a moment when something frustrates you or something's rubbing you the wrong way. That's a really great indicator, okay, there's something going on there I need to pay attention to. There's an awareness that you have to have in that moment. I think as men in particular, and I'm going to couch this both from a gender perspective, but also just more generally, right, is pay attention when you get into a group of people. Pay attention to what's going on around you. Pay attention to who's speaking up. Pay attention who's not speaking up. And if you notice in particular, the dynamics in the room don't make it easy for a woman to speak up, then look for ways to bring that woman into the conversation. So a simple we haven't heard from you, what do you think? Are you contemplating this? Tell us I'd love to hear your thoughts. Whatever you can, and that's something that we should just be doing with people in general. Because when we're in a group, all voices should be heard. And so it's not necessarily a woman's voice that's not being heard. But the bottom line in particular, it's really important to be paying attention to that. It's very easy, and I've had this happen to me, and I know it's inadvertent, so that's on me to sort of get over it rather quickly, but then make sure I'm speaking up right away. But I've had, inadvertently, men cut me off in conversations. Now, the interesting thing is there's a bias there, right? Because did they cut me off because I'm a woman and are tired of hearing of me? Probably not. They're probably just tired of what I have to say. And that may have nothing to do with me being a woman. And so I have to get over that very quickly. But if I do have something to say, then I sort of have to advocate for myself to bring myself back in the conversation. If in that moment, though, the dynamics feel hostile to me, I will not do that. I'm going to be quiet. And I've had this happen with really, and I say wonderful men, who notice it and come right back at me and say, you had something you were sharing earlier. Did you finish that thought? Share that thought with us. And the idea is they're bringing me back and inviting me back into the conversation because in that moment it did not feel safe for me to speak up any further. So those are the things that I would say at a high level, every now and then be a fly on the wall and pay attention to just what's going on in the dynamics of that space. And ask yourself, is there anything that I can do to bring quieter voices or more silent voices in? Is there anyone who feels shut out? Is there anyone who just got shut out that I need to bring back in? One thing I'll share for all of you, students in particular, as leaders, that's your obligation. That is your obligation as a leader to do that for your people. And so the bottom line is to start practicing it now when you're in your group with your peers. I think that's really critical.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I'd also like to put in a plug for one of our colleagues' books. Anne Tenbrunzel has a book called Blind Spots, and it talks about the kinds of biases that we're discussing today. There are also in the book some really good examples of men when they had their aha moment and they realized that they were being biased. The other thing I would say is the more you expose yourself to strong, powerful women, the more likely you are to see them as equals. And so you'll be better able to attend to the kinds of things that Alice is suggesting that you attend to. So pay attention. Who are you teaming up with in classes? Is it all same gender, or are you working in mixed gendered groups? Like, do your best to interact with people that are different from you in all kinds of characteristics as much as possible.
And there are also a number of instruments out there that you can complete in assessments. There is implicit bias training in different programs that you can learn more about. Now, I will say that the assessments there's some controversy around the development of those assessments, but at least it might give you some starting points for when someone mentions the word CEO, what type of image pops into your mind immediately? Is it a man, is it a woman? I mean, that's a very easy way to begin to check some of those areas of biases that you might hold. I think the bottom line is the intentionality. There is an intention behind paying more attention and behind listening to your colleagues and seeking out other individuals who you would like to work with. So being intentional and making those choices and starting now, as the group mentioned.
All right, thank you. So this concludes our Women in the Workplace program, and I want to thank Cindy Muir and Alice Obermiller and Angela Logan and Amanda McKendree for speaking and for being part of this panel. Really do appreciate it.